Time for Bible class. Let's get started. Yeah, I know. They're getting it. All right. Let's get started with a prayer. I'm going to ask Charles to lead a prayer for us this morning to get us started.
Our Heavenly Father, we're truly thankful to you for the blessings that you bestow on us. We thank you this morning for the rain that we've received over the last couple of days. We thank you for all that you do for us, and we pray that this morning as we enter into another study of the Word, that you help us to be attentive, to remove worldly thoughts from our mind, pay attention to what's being said. We might take your Word to our lives and might be better examples to others and be others to you. Father, we pray for those that are traveling today in the stormy weather, to be with them. We ask that you would help us to live our lives better in accordance with your will. We pray in Jesus' name.
Amen. Well, as you know, we've been, our focus this year has been on the family of God, and so we're going to continue to study this morning in that vein. Our study this morning is going to be the role of parents and grandparents in teaching their children about faith. So before I even start with a lesson, I want to just say something before, so I don't forget about it or run out of time at the end. Just like all lessons that we do, if all we do is talk about it and agree how great a lesson it was, or you may or may not, but talk about how great a lesson it is, but if it doesn't change us, if we don't do something different, if we don't do something better to become more like Christ, then it's just academic. And that's not what we want. We're going to talk about that some as we talk about some of these passages and verses. So, and along those lines, that's the reason we're doing our this Sunday night. Tonight we will have our small group break out, and the purpose of that is to be able to make application of these things that we're teaching, so that we can be as far encouragement, but also for accountability, because it's easy for us to sit in here and say, man, that's a great idea, but then not ever do it, not ever do anything different, not ever change, and not ever get more like Christ, and then we don't become more like the congregation that God wants us to be. So think about that as we're going through this study, because that's really the purpose. The purpose of meditating on God's Word is so that it changes our heart and then changes our actions in our life, and that's what we want it to do. So as we think about our role as parents and grandparents, let's think about taking action in these, and I hope that this lesson will motivate us to do the things that we need to be doing. Let's read first in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 9. Deuteronomy 4:9. It says, "Only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children." So, obviously, the point of our lesson today is to understand the God-given responsibility that we have as parents, as leaders in the home, to teach our children the faith that we have. And that's really one of the, I think, things that's emphasized here, is to be intentional about it. It's not something that's just going to happen. As we get better at it, it will just happen in the course of our day. It will happen as we converse about things, as things come up, as we deal with problems. Our faith will actually come out in all those areas if we're doing the right things and we're growing. But he starts off there in that verse about take care. He says, take care of you're talking about yourself. If we don't keep our own soul, we're not going to be able to teach our children how to keep their soul, right? We're not going to be a very good steward of their soul if we're not a good steward of our own soul. And so that's one of the things that's being emphasized here in this verse, is for us to work on ourselves, to grow. Personal growth is important, and it's a continual process. We're never going to get to the point where, I'm glad I got that, I don't have to worry about that anymore. we're always learning, or we should be. When we get to that point, we're in trouble. If we get to that point that we think we got it all figured out, then we're in trouble. It's interesting. He says here, lest you forget. You think about that. Well, am I going to forget the gospel? Am I going to forget all these things that I've been taught? Yeah, obviously we're only retain so much information, but I think there's the point being made here is a little bit bigger in that we have to continue to practice. We have to continue to do these things. We've got to continue to study, kind of like what we were just talking about. You got to continue to study. You're not ever going to arrive, and we've got to put into practice the things that we learn. We've got to be, living these things out. And that's one of the things I really want us to focus on this morning as we talk about these different verses is this idea of really living it out, of practicing. He mentions here too, teach your children and your children's children. That's an important aspect of this because that's easy to miss sometimes when we think about it. As grandparents, and many of us are, it's our responsibility too. It's different. Our responsibility is different than it was with our children. Hopefully, if you did a good job raising your children, then your role as a grandparent is different. But this does show this idea of it being multi-generational, of the impact of us as a family. And you can even that can be expanded to think about an opportunity and a role that we all play in each other's children's lives. We should all be thinking about ourselves as examples to other people's children too, and our interactions with them and our comments and the things that we can say and do to help them as well. So that's something that we always need to be cognizant of, is thinking about the impact that we can have on our children, but also on other people's children. You're going to have, if you got kids and you got grandkids, you're going to have opportunities to have other people's children in your home. It can be other people's children who are Christians, and it can be non-Christians. So we need to take that responsibility seriously too, because those are opportunities that God's given us to influence our children and other people's children, and for our children to see us influence other people's children, and where we put the focus in our life and where we put the importance. Let's read another passage in Psalms 78, 4 through 7. Who's got a loud voice who wants to read that for me? Psalm 78, 4 through 7. Okay, Chris. You have a loud voice.
We will not hide them from our children, telling to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and His strength, His wonderful works that He has done. For He established testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers, that they should keep them and make known to their children, that the generation to come might know them. The children who would be born, that they may arise and declare them to their children, that they may set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments.
Okay.
It may not be like...
No, that's good. That's good. I mean, you can read it out if you see it.
It may not be like their fathers, a stubborn, rebellious generation, a generation that did not set its heart aright, and whose spirit was not faithful to God.
We don't want to be that generation. We want to do what... And did Israel do a very good job at this? Terrible job. And so we see how that transpired, and we don't want that to happen. So they're not a good example for us, but in the positive, but they're a good example for us in the negative. But the point being here is we see several different things in this passage. Obviously, the emphasis on teaching our children, but also as we think about it, for us to think about the impact that we can have generationally, because this mentions even the unborn children, the children that haven't been born yet. I did we bought these little things for our kids, and made all the girls cry. But they had these the story of Christmas. The night before Christmas, that little story that we read. We always read it on Christmas Eve. I read it to all the kids, and at the time I found these things. They're recorded, like where I can record my voice saying that, reading this to the kids. And at the time, I think we only had a couple of grandkids. I can't remember, but I think we only had a couple. And I referenced in there, that You may not even be here yet, but if you're hearing this, it's because I'm not with you to read it to you. And of course, that made the girls all cry, and I cried a little bit myself at one point. But the point being is that we can have an impact on generations that are not even born yet by the things that we will have. We will have an impact. The question is what kind of impact will it be? Will it be a positive impact? Will it be a good thing, or will it not be a good thing? And so that's something that we need to take very seriously. He mentions in this passage in Psalms, he's talking about what was mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 6, which is a verse that we, go to all the time in thinking about teaching our children. But he says to teach diligently your children. He mentions in this verse that God had established that as a command for us to do. And we see the implications that it has positively or negative, whether we do it or we don't do it. So the one thing to think about, obviously, in this is that we have to be willing to grow personally. We have to keep growing ourselves if we're going to be able to teach our kids. We can't pass something down that we don't have. We can't teach what we don't know, and we need to make sure that we're putting the effort into our personal growth to be able to do and be what we need to be for our kids and our grandkids. One thing too, that we have to understand and appreciate the responsibility of the fact that this is this responsibility is given primarily to parents. It's not the responsibility of this congregation's educational department to teach your children. We want to do all we can. We want to be as effective as we can in doing that. But it's your responsibility, and you've got to take that responsibility. As leaders in the home, we've got to be willing to stand up and understand and appreciate the fact that God's looking to me to do this, and if I don't do it, it's going to have implications with my children and their children. If you really look, you can think yourself about people, about men and women that are contemporary to you who, because of what they did, they have faithful children that are still living out in faith, the gospel. And you can think about people who, because of the way that they live, their children are not faithful anymore. And so we need to appreciate and understand that the ramifications of doing that. We're told, Proverbs 22 tells us, 22:6 says, train up a child in the way that he should go. That's our responsibility. Ephesians 6:4 says, bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. It's our responsibility to do that. Joshua 24:15 says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And there's an important aspect of that verse. It says we will serve the Lord. It didn't just say we will teach our children about serving the Lord. We're going to teach our children Bible stories. It says that we're going to serve the Lord, and so that encompasses a lot more than just teaching. Yes, sir?
Kids, they got this excuse that, well, my parents shoved Christianity down my throat when I was growing up. I don't want food. That's just an excuse. I don't know whether they may have tried to start too late in their life, or they're just, at one point, a child is going to be accountable at a certain age. I don't know what that age may be, so it may be sooner than others. But it's not because the parents shoved it down the throat, it's because they've made a decision that they do something.
Well, it may be because of something that the parents shoved down their throat, but it wasn't Christianity. It wasn't Christianity if it drove them away from God, probably. But more likely, sir.
Doesn't mean 100% effective.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
We still need to try to do that.
Well, it's a very high percentage. It's a very high percentage effective, but there definitely is. I mean, we're all free will agents, and so we certainly, children can make their own decision. But that's another reason why we ought to be so diligent about this, because they are free will agents, and they're going to be influenced by a lot of things in their life. And if we're not influencing them positively, and then they're going to be influenced negatively by the world. And the thing I think, and we'll get into that a little bit more, is that it may be if Christianity was only academic, it's not going to be effective. Yeah.
And the churches will be busting at the seams.
Say it again.
The churches will be busting at the seams.
If-
It's academic.
Huh?
If it were just,
If it was just absolutely. We're good at the academic, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean,
We're just not good at the application sometimes.
the solution was just more information than. If that was God's solution to it, He's told us the solution. But if that was the solution, then we'd be, whatever, thousands and thousands strong.
Yes. Well, and I'll say this. I mean, I was going to get to it a little bit later, but based on just to go along with what you're saying, Dean, is I'm thoroughly convinced that there are many children. I can look back at contemporaries of mine, people who I knew in the church and whose children were in the church at the time, who came to church just as much as we did. And their children don't attend, some of them don't attend any church, some of them attend denominational churches, so there are different reasons for that. But here's what I think the biggest shortcoming is, and the reason that it happens to the greatest extent is that we're not living out this faith that we're teaching them. They don't see us serving other people. They don't see us sharing the gospel with people. They don't see that concern, and it's not real in our life, so it doesn't become real in their life. It is just academic. It's just these things we learn. We go down to this building and we learn all this stuff, but Dad doesn't practice it. Mom doesn't practice it. They don't do it. They just talk about it, And see, that don't mean they're bad people. That doesn't mean they may have less of a sin problem than me or you do, in terms of just something going on in our life. But it's when we don't live that out in front of our children, I think really makes a big impact on them in a very negative way. When they don't see us living it out, we're teaching it, but we're not living it out. And some of that falls on the leadership of the church, because we have for years and years and years held people accountable for attendance and for giving, but we never held anybody accountable for being evangelistic. We said we did. We'll bring somebody to the gospel meeting or this, but in terms of us impacting people in our lives that we come in contact with in each and every day, we've not, as a whole, the church has not been holding people responsible for being evangelistic. And I really think that that's a big difference. One of the big things that we see in children falling away is because we're not living out the things that we're teaching to them. So that's a good point.
It's like my boys, they'll when you go through this thing with, like they're doing algebra or something like that, and they say, I'll never want to use this. And the reality is, they probably will never use it.
Right.
And so that's why they abandon it. Like when's the last time you calculated a perfect trinomial?
I would have to go look that up to even see it. But since I can't remember what it is, I probably haven't done it. So.
But you spend all that time
Yes.
with the foolishness of it, right? And I'm probably one of the few people that has, that you know. Well, that being said, the difference in that is that when Christianity becomes, if you understand, like I'll take Aiden and I'll show him how he already does those things. And all of a sudden it becomes more tangible to him.
Right.
Because he, of course, he's the one that's, this is stupid, I don't want to, I'll never use this. Well, he technically already is using it. And so you take it out of the realm of academia and then you place it into the realm of application.
Right.
When we learned it academically, that Sally had 10 apples and Johnny had 12 apples, what's the ratio of Sally's apples? I mean, there's no tangible, there's nothing tangible to it. It's all hypothetical. But when we bring the chickens home to roost, then it's like, okay, now we're into this Karate Kid principle of wax on, wax off.
And that's part of teaching, is making it applicable and modeling it.
Yeah.
How do you teach? One of the most effective ways to teach is modeling. And if you're teaching something that you're not modeling, it's typically not as effective, right? Why do we have a lab when we do school? We have labs so that you can actually do the things that you're talking about theoretically. Yes, sir?
I really believe strongly that the power of prayer is amazing. And I believe, like in our case, we're still receiving the benefits from the prayers of our grandfathers who've been gone for many years. And I think we should be praying for our family, and most of us hopefully do every day.
Yes.
That, you know, every one of your grandchildren or great-grandchildren and all that may not end up being what you would pray for them to be in your lifetime, but it can certainly happen, you know, and it's very true. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he won't depart from it. And all this, too, is reinforcing the Hebrew writer that we should not forsake the assembling of the brethren.
Yes, absolutely. You know, the thing that's encouraging, though, or should be encouraging to us about teaching our children when they're young, if you plant that word in their heart deeply and it's there, it's always going to be bothering them. You know, so even if they appear, you know, because that's the thing, and we should continue to pray. I mean, we know people who, you know, at this point in their life, they're not faithful. So we should continue to pray for them. And the good thing is when that word's been planted in their heart, it's always going to be there. You know, I read something one time years ago. A priest said, if you give me a child when he's 5 years old, he won't ever be anything but a Catholic. You know, and it's because they're going to plant those teachings in there. And so you can plant the wrong teachings just as good as you can the right teachings. You can plant but if we're planting the right things in their hearts, it's there, you know, and it's going to stay there with them. And even though they may mess up, they may make mistakes, they may go awry, it's still there. And so that's another reason that it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we're teaching that.
That's a good point. Even if they do turn away, but you taught them as a young child the word, when they grow up, it's easier for them to come back to it than it is to try to teach them later on when they never had it. So it's a lot of good benefits.
It's grinding against their conscience every day, you know, and they know it's not right, and they have to deal with that. Now, eventually, their hearts can be hardened, and they can completely turn away. But there's a tremendous power and benefit in having taught our children when they're young, because we always have hope. You know, we have hope that they're going to come back. So, were you going to say something else? You look like you had a good idea.
No, I'm just trying to think of him to do that.
So, thinking about now from a grandparent standpoint, well, I guess let's just ask a question to think about. You know, what does it look like to make your home a place where God's known? I mean, it's just a practical thing to think about. And these are some of the kind of things that we're working on the fourth Sundays when our groups break out, and we have some practical application. You know, Kobe did a good job. You know, we're trying to do, on our second Sundays, we're teaching a lesson that kind of focuses on and looks forward to what we're going to do on the fourth Sunday. And this one obviously looks forward to part of what we're going to be focused on and thinking about. But what does our home need to look like? What does things in our home need to look like to shape our children? There you go. Obviously, Bible stories. And that's another good point about starting them young. You know, when you start them when they're very young, they'll be bugging you and wanting to do it. Now you get somebody that's Aiden's age, and you want to start trying to do devotions at home. It's hard. You know, they're going to have their own ideas about things. I mean, some kids it may not be as hard. But the point is, if you started them out young, they're going to be bugging you and wanting to do those Bible lessons, because they're going to enjoy them. They're going to be learning from them if we're doing the right thing. So that's obviously a good thing, and that's one of the focuses that we've had. I mean, there's probably nothing more beneficial for the kingdom that we can do as a congregation than teach our children in our home. You know, be consistent in teaching our children. There's probably, I don't know what else it would be. Of course, going along with that is living it out in front of them, you know. So, anybody else?
You know, something else, there needs to be an open Bible present in the home. And it does not need to be as decoration. It needs to be for daily use. And the family should sit down and read a little bit out of that Bible every day, have a little discussion, and that should be started even before the kids are old enough to read.
It goes along with Deuteronomy chapter 6, about putting the things they put on their heads and on their sleeves and on the doorpost of their homes and that kind of stuff. That's right. There's a physical representation to see that. So that's certainly a positive thing. So, anybody else? All right. So just thinking about now, just a little bit, changing gears just a little bit towards the grandparents. What are things grandparents can do? It's the verse that we read explicitly mentions teaching to the children's children. So it's talking about, grandparents. What, there have been several different studies. I had seen one the other day, and then I looked at, and there's several that have been done that demonstrates that children do better and are more successful if their grandparents are in their life. If they're in an environment where they have parental guidance, but also have grandparents in their life. And this ought to help us as grandparents be willing to do this. The study showed that grandparents live longer when they're involved in their grandchildren's lives. So that's kind of a neat bonus there, I think. So the thing is we can really have a positive impact. In 2 Timothy 1:5, we see talking about Timothy, Paul said that he said, your sincere faith dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. So we see there that this grandmother and mother had a tremendous influence on Timothy. Where was the dad? I don't know. But this does demonstrate if dad won't do it, mom needs to do it. Mom needs to be doing it. So Psalms 145:4 says, one generation shall commend your works to another, talking about the works of God, teaching about God, teaching about the nature of God. Proverbs 17:6 says, grandchildren are the crown of the aged. That's absolutely true. I mean, and obviously, when they're faithful, it's a great source of pride as we get older. So, kind of like what was mentioned already, we need to pray for our grandchildren. We need to pray for our grandchildren's children that aren't born yet. We need to pray with our grandchildren. When you're around them, when they're in your home, you need to do Bible studies with them, and you need to take opportunities to teach them and to pray with them, not just for them. So, like I said, it's something that's incumbent upon us, and it's always going to be more powerful when we have the parents, the grandparents, and the church building these children up and teaching them and reinforcing these things in their lives. Yes, sir?
The lessons don't even have to be formal. It has to be the thought of what God has taught us and bring it to mind in the situation as it presents itself. And that can happen anytime.
Absolutely. And in some ways is most effective. It may be some of the most effective. I told this story. We did the father and son and mother-daughter thing a few weeks ago, and I told this. It made me, preparing for this lesson and preparing for that one, it made me think about this. When I was probably 6 or 8 years old, and there were other occasions. I remember certain things and times, and my dad had pet verses and stuff, but this one particular time I remember, and we were, the house that we lived in, I know it was before I was 8 because we moved from there when I was 8, and but we were on the carport, laying down on the ground for some reason. I don't know if I was out there playing and he came out there with me or what happened, but I was about 6 to 8 years old. He was in his early 30s, and he talked about Jesus being his age during his ministry and about his crucifixion and the ministry of Christ. And I remember that, I mean, why do I remember that, Those are the kind of moments that you can make, though, with your kids when you're teaching them those kind of things. Yes, sir?
People spend a lot of time with their kids and grandkids, teaching them all kinds of things. Teaching them sports, educational things, like schoolwork.
Yeah.
And, you take most things, let's say, you're not going to teach your kids and grandkids baseball if you don't know how to play baseball. You're not going to teach them how to hunt and fish if you don't hunt fish. You hadn't done that. And so sometimes I think people think of the church, well, they don't know where to start or how to do this. But you know, these commands that God gives them, they're not like optional. I mean, they're just straight out commands. You got to do this. So if I don't know how to do something, it's really incumbent on me to send people out that can help me learn and teach me how to do what I need to do to be effective at teaching my children, my grandchildren, and ultimately, that's really what God created part of. That's the way the church is supposed to work. We have all these resources to help you become what God wants you to be, needs you to be, intends for you to be as a parent, as a man.
Absolutely. Yep. And again, that ties back into what we're talking about on our fourth Sundays. You know, it's one of the things with our devotions, our home devotionals with our kids. You know, we're willing to come and help you get a devotional started. We have all this material. We got 4 or 5, how many years of 4 solid years of material, weekly devotional lessons that are already written up for you to use, for you to utilize. And so we're trying to make it as easy for you as possible, but that's a very good point that Tom makes, is that there's tons of people here that are willing to come help you do that, come help you be able to do what God has commanded us to do. That's right. That's a great point. It's not optional. Yes, ma'am? I'm going to ask you to speak up a little bit. I'm even missing one hearing aid today, so I'm having to ask y'all to be more patient than usual with me.
I was relating to when you said your father came out and told you about
Yes.
how old Jesus was at that time. When I was younger, my mother relayed to myself and my brothers and sisters that there's only one church that we'll ever attend, and that's the Church of Christ. And she said, we won't go anywhere else but the Church of Christ. This is the only church that I've ever been. It's the Church of Christ. So when I got married, this is the only church that my children knew was the Church of Christ, because I had no affiliation with any other church. But she said, we will not go anywhere else but to the Church of Christ.
Well, you.
To this day, I think I was about your age, about 6 or 7, when she said this, and that's the only church I know of. This is the only church that I know of. I don't know anything about Catholic Church or the Baptist Church, Methodist Church, anything else. This is the only church that I know.
Well, you're a demonstration of the power of teaching our children when they're young, right? Absolutely. All right. Remember where? Oh, talking about things that we can do as grandparents. So, we need to take that serious as grandparents too, and those opportunities that we have to teach our grandchildren. Obviously, we're going to have more impact on our children when parents, grandparents, and the church is working to make that happen and strengthen those relationships. Thinking about what we should teach, what we should be teaching. I mentioned before about the Old Testament stories. The power of teaching the nature of God, understanding God's nature, His compassion, His love, His long-suffering with us. All these things can be taught through, with kids starting very young. I mean, it's surprising sometimes how much they can pick up and how much they can learn on these things, from these things. I think it's important too that they understand, as we teach these things, they understand the why behind what we do and why we do the things that we do. Sometimes it can become just a rote exercise, and people can be young adults and not really understand why we do some things that we do. And so that's not a good thing. We need to make sure that we're teaching the why. In Exodus 12:26 and 27, it says, and when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? They were talking about the Passover. It said, you shall say it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, for He passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when He struck the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed their heads and worshipped. So, teaching children the reason behind the things that we do is very important. You know, those lessons that they learn from those things. I mean, obviously the story accounts are beneficial from that standpoint, but you know, really making sure that they appreciate, you know, why we do the things we do and what we do and the impact that it's going to have. And we talked about earlier, you know, Psalms 119:11 says, "I've stored up your word in my heart that I might not sin against you." You know, what are we going to draw from when we have to make decisions in our life? Well, if we're going to draw from the word, we got to have the word in our hearts to draw from it. It's kind of hard to. Now, I mean, obviously, we can go study it, we can go look it up, but if we have equipped ourselves appropriately, many decisions in life are going to be much easier because we know the answers to them. You know, we see people in the world doing things sometimes and say, man, how'd they think that was going to work out? Well, they made decisions based on their experiences, based on their knowledge, what they had been taught, and it wasn't good stuff, and they made really big mistakes. You know, so that's one reason. That's one of the things of the power, planting that word deep in our children's hearts. An example we see.
Bite off more you can chew when you're trying to read a story to a grandchild that's 6 or 7 years old, and you tell them, yeah, God told Saul to kill everything, kill everybody. And they give you this puzzle look. I mean, he killed the dogs and the cats and the cows and the children and the mamas. And you come to a point where how do you explain to a child that God commanded a man to kill him? I said, baby, that question, I can answer that later on. I'm just going through some experiences that really trouble me sometimes. I didn't know how to explain to a 7 or 8 year old that God told him to kill a child.
Well, we see another benefit there then from that is that, sure, but you teaching it to your child, if you were uncomfortable with how to answer that question, you had to go study and figure out what the answer to that question was too. So it's another benefit from that, you know, because obviously God is God, and God can know and do things beyond what we can know and do. So, but that does make a good point. Is that, you know, we need to be age appropriate with what we're teaching our children too. Yes, sir.
Another good example is we're not going to have all the answers as parents and grandparents, but there's people we can and resources
Sure.
we can talk with them. Because those questions sometimes are pretty fundamental to their faith. You know, when if you can't answer something, you just fail over. That's not a good place to
Right.
kids. You know, one of those. Well, this is just the way it is. It's not necessarily.
That's right. Yeah, and if there's those kind of things, I've heard Tom say it many times, if there's those kind of things in your life that are troubling you that you're not quite sure about, don't let them sit there. Pursue it. Figure it out. You know, something that you have a question or a doubt about, you need to make sure that you solve that in your mind so that you have a good understanding about that. So don't let those kind of things, because Satan will use those little doubts in your life at some point, and circumstances happen a certain way and things, and he can use those things against you to get you off track. Yes, sir.
And you know, to kind of bridge both of them together, it's also a teachable moment and with your kids that, like, I love your attitude, I love you want to know why, and I'm not ready, I don't know if I really understand the answer to that myself. And just as much as you're learning, I'm learning too.
Sure.
And so that'll give us something we can do together.
Absolutely.
So
Well,
you've left the bite of the sandwich on the table.
yeah, we don't have to be kind of like along the lines of what Tom's saying is there's plenty of resources. We don't have to be a theologian to be able to teach our children. There's a tremendous power in praying in front of your children and in reading the Bible in front of your children and talking about those things in front of your children. That's where that's so important for them to see you do it. Somebody else can do it better, but nobody can do it more effectively than you can as a parent. You know, it's going to be most effective when you do it. And all of these things that we teach these kids from a very early age, you know, Scripture builds towards salvation. If you understand the Bible and it's all laid out, I mean, the whole purpose of all this being recorded was to bring us to the point of salvation. In 2 Timothy 3:14 and 15, it says, "But as you continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it, and how from childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus." See, all these things we're pointing towards and working towards that day when that child is accountable. And all these foundational teachings that we put in their heart are going to impact that and make that all make sense to them when these things, when they have to start making these kind of hard decisions in their life. And so that, again, is another tremendous benefit of planting the Word in our children's hearts, our grandchildren's hearts all this time. So real quick, just before we wrap up, also, it's important, and we've touched on this a little bit, but, this children need teaching. They need these lessons and things taught to them, but they also need an example. They need an example. They need it modeled if it's going to be effective for you. Going back to Deuteronomy 6, it talked about when you sit, when you walk, when you lie down, when you rise, and it's talking about teaching, obviously, but it's also talking about how you live, how you serve, what you do. In terms of the impact that you're going to have on these kids is going to be, what's going on in your life. Yes, ma'am.
Growing up, I didn't get to know my grandparents because they died before I was born. But where I was raised, I had a aunt that had a mother there. She was like a grandmother to me. I will never forget the love, the support, and devotion that she gave me. And she was not my grandmother. But those are the kind of things kids don't forget.
Absolutely.
Your love, your support, the devotion, the safety that you're giving them, and that's something we need to remember to pass on to child.
That has to be going along with the teaching.
Yes.
And along with the example. Now, we can love them, and I've seen some pretty crazy examples of mothers who were a mess that, certainly weren't setting the right example and weren't teaching their kids the right things, but they still loved them and they still, cared for them. But that's a very important thing as far as that is what they're going to remember from that compassion standpoint, but we got to do all of it. So good point. I don't remember what. So, talking about as we walk and as we live, as we sit, as we walk, as we lie down, as we rise up, all these kind of things, that we're setting the example for them, that they see it in our lives. They see these things that we've taught. We see them alive in our life. Matthew 5:16 says, "In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." They see your good works. It doesn't say see your good teaching. Now, obviously, teaching's part of it, but who needs to see your good works more than your children or your grandchildren? Those that you're trying to influence. So that's going to be that's going to make the difference. Obviously, we're commanded to teach, and we're also commanded to live in a certain way. And so it's that living it out in front of these children that's going to make the difference. And like I said, I'm firmly convinced that in most cases, that's the reason children fall away. They've learned all this stuff academically, but it's not been modeled to them by their parents and their grandparents to see and to reinforce the validity of what they've been taught. There was as we study, as we do that, as we live out our faith in front of our kids, we give them an opportunity to serve as well. Take your kids with you. I know Chris has changed, put plugs on dryers with Liam or Ryan there with him, doing it. The only reason he's doing it is to get an opportunity to talk to that person about the gospel. So, when you serve, when you do something for somebody, take them with you. And when they ask you, why are we doing this? Then you have that opportunity to teach them that. And you need to, as early as you possibly can, start giving them the responsibility of serving, of doing. There was another study, I've been on studies here lately, but they said this was the longest study that had ever been done. I don't know, but it was over 75 years that this study was done, and they tracked kids through adulthood and retirement, and to try to find the one common denominator in all of them as far as success, being successful in life, having a fruitful, productive life. Now, obviously, it's that's by the world standard, but there's some correlation here. But you know what it was? That was pretty interesting. It was pretty interesting to me. They were able to correlate all the children who had the greatest success were given chores. They had chores to do in their home. They had responsibilities that were given to them. And because of that, they learned to do things. Did the bell ring? I only got one hearing aid, sorry. So because of that, they learned to do things that when they recognized something needed to be done without being told to do it. And that was a pretty powerful thing to me. And so as we teach our children to serve, then they're going to have that in them to want to be able to do that if we teach them the right way. Thank you all. I appreciate all your comments.